February 23, 1945, 0400 hours, Santo Tomas internment camp, Manila. Navy nurse Lieutenant Ann Bernatitus stood in the makeshift hospital ward, listening to something through the pre-dawn darkness that made no sense according to everything she understood about Japanese control of Manila, American offensive capabilities, and whether 77 American nurses imprisoned for 3 years could possibly survive until liberation arrived. Artillery shells were landing in Manila, not Japanese artillery firing at advancing Americans, American artillery firing at Japanese positions surrounding Santo Tomas. The sound was coming from the north, where 1st Cavalry Division was reportedly approaching. The volume and frequency of explosions suggested major assault rather than probing attack. Liberation might be hours away rather than days or weeks. But between the nurses and freedom stood 200 Japanese guards who had threatened to execute all prisoners if American forces approached the camp. Bernatitus had been prisoner since January 2, 1942, when Japanese forces captured Manila and imprisoned American military nurses at Santo Tomas University, converting the campus into internment camp holding 3,000 American and Allied civilians, plus the 77 military nurses. For 3 years, she and her fellow Navy and Army nurses had operated makeshift hospital treating internee patients, despite Japanese regulations prohibiting medical care, despite critical shortages of medicine and equipment, despite malnutrition weakening everyone, despite Japanese commandant threatening execution if nurses didn't follow orders limiting their medical activities. The nurses had defied every order that would have meant patients dying. When Japanese prohibited surgery, they performed emergency operations at night when guards weren't watching. When Japanese cut medical supply allocations, they improvised equipment from salvaged materials and traded personal possessions for black market medicine. When Japanese forbade treating certain conditions, they reclassified diagnoses to justify treatment. When Japanese ordered reducing hospital capacity, they hid patients in alternate locations. For 3 years, through systematic defiance of regulations designed to let prisoners die, the nurses had kept their hospital alive, treating 10,000 patient admissions while preventing disease outbreaks that would have killed hundreds in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Think about that moment. February 23, 1945. 77 American military nurses, 66 Army nurses and 11 Navy nurses who had survived 3 years of imprisonment through courage, ingenuity and defiance were hours from liberation. But Japanese guards surrounded by advancing American forces might execute prisoners rather than surrender. The nurses faced choice between hiding to survive liberation or continuing to treat patients in hospital that made them visible targets if guards started killing prisoners. What Bernatitus didn't know as she listened to artillery fire was that 1st Cavalry Division was already inside Manila, and the 2 armoured columns were racing towards Santo Tomas at that exact moment in desperate attempt to reach camp before guards executed prisoners. That regimental commander had ordered full-speed advance despite darkness and Japanese resistance because intelligence indicated guards might massacre prisoners, that tanks would crash through camp gates at 2100 hours that evening, 8 months earlier than prisoners expected liberation, ending longest imprisonment of American military nurses in history. What Bernatitus didn't know was that all 77 nurses would survive, making them the only group of military women captured in Philippines who didn't lose members to execution, disease, or starvation despite 3 years of brutal captivity. That survival rate would be attributed partly to their medical knowledge preventing disease and treating malnutrition, partly to their organizational discipline maintaining morale and structure, and partly to their calculated defiance of Japanese orders that would have prevented medical care prisoners needed to survive. What Bernatitus didn't know was that 40 years later, in 1985, she would publish memoir describing her experience titled Defiant Nurses: How 77 Women Kept Hope Alive in Japanese Prison Camp, that her memoir would reveal systematic pattern of defiance where nurses had collectively decided in 1942 that saving patients required violating Japanese regulations and that accepting execution risk was preferable to watching patients die from neglect. That this decision, made by women in their 20s and 30s who had never faced combat before capture, demonstrated courage equal to any battlefield valor. What Bernatitus didn't know was that Japanese treatment of Allied nurses in Philippines would contrast dramatically with Japanese treatment of male POWs, creating gender-based survival disparity that revealed different treatment standards. That male POWs faced forced labor, systematic brutality, and 27% mortality rate, while female POWs faced harsh conditions but lower systematic violence and approximately 5% mortality rate. That this disparity wasn't mercy but calculation. Japanese military culture viewed male prisoners as legitimate targets for abuse, while viewing female prisoners as less threatening, requiring less harsh treatment to control. What Bernatitus didn't know was that nurses' experience would become model for studying how professional training and group cohesion enable survival in extreme conditions. That psychologists would analyze their testimony, documenting how maintaining professional roles, supporting group morale, and finding purpose through serving others enabled psychological resilience, preventing breakdown despite prolonged captivity. That their survival rate would be partly attributed to these psychological factors beyond just medical knowledge. What Bernatitus didn't know was that some nurses would face criticism after war for not being more confrontational with Japanese captors. That military authorities would question whether nurses should have resisted more aggressively or attempted escape rather than accepting imprisonment. That nurses would respond by pointing to their survival rate and patient outcomes. All 77 survived, and they treated 10,000 patients over 3 years, arguing that achieving these results required calculated defiance rather than suicidal resistance. What Bernatitus didn't know was that her memoir would reveal tensions within nurse group about how much risk to accept through defiance. That some nurses had advocated following all Japanese regulations to avoid provoking guards, while others had argued that saving patients required accepting execution risk. That group had resolved tension by making collective decisions about which orders to defy, creating consensus that protected unity while enabling defiance necessary for patient care. What Bernatitus didn't know was that Nurses' Hospital at Santo Tomas would treat more patients with better outcomes than many military field hospitals operating with full supplies and equipment. That, despite lacking antibiotics, modern surgical tools, adequate nutrition, and basic sanitation, the nurses would achieve survival rates comparable to fully equipped facilities through improvisation, dedication, and willingness to work 16-hour days treating patients without adequate rest or food for themselves. The mathematics of survival were being written in patient charts and improvised treatments and calculated risks that defied Japanese orders designed to let prisoners die. And those mathematics were proving something that would be studied by military medical professionals for decades: that determination, professional training, and calculated courage could overcome resource poverty that would have overwhelmed less committed medical personnel. By the time American tanks crashed through Santo Tomas gates at 2100 hours on February 23, 1945, liberating the camp and ending 3 years of imprisonment, the nurses had already won their battle. Not through military force, but through sustained defiance of regulations that would have meant patient deaths. Their hospital had survived, their patients had survived, and all 77 nurses had survived to witness liberation they had worked 3 years to reach. January 2nd, 1942. Meanwhile, on January 2nd, 1942, when Japanese forces captured Manila, 77 American military nurses faced decision about whether to evacuate to Corregidor or remain in Manila, treating patients who couldn't be moved. Captain Maude Davison's diary entry from January 2, 1942, preserved at Army Nurse Corps archives, documented the decision that would determine these women's fate for next 3 years. The diary entry stated, Japanese entering Manila, General MacArthur's headquarters evacuating to Corregidor. Army nurses ordered to evacuate, Navy nurses also ordered south, but we have patients who cannot be moved, surgical cases, disease patients, wounded soldiers. If we evacuate, they die. Gathered nurses to make collective decision. Vote was unanimous. We stay with patients regardless of consequences. The diary documented nurses' understanding of risks according to preserved entry. Davison stated, "We know Japanese treatment of prisoners is brutal. We've heard reports from China of executions, torture, starvation. But we cannot abandon patients who depend on us. Our duty as nurses requires staying. We will face whatever comes together." 77 nurses, 66 Army, 11 Navy, committed to remaining in Manila and accepting whatever fate Japanese decide for us. Most significantly, the diary revealed nurses established principles that would guide their conduct during captivity. According to preserved entry, we agreed on core commitments, maintain professional standards regardless of conditions, support each other through difficulties, never abandon patients even if ordered to do so, and preserve dignity despite degradation Japanese might inflict. These commitments would be tested repeatedly over coming years. Today we make solemn promise to uphold them no matter what happens. January-March 1942. Ann Bernatitus's memoir described capture and initial imprisonment with detail revealing Japanese guards' confusion about how to treat female military prisoners. According to the memoir, Japanese forces took control of hospitals where nurses were working on January 3, 1942. The memoir stated, Japanese soldiers entered hospitals with weapons drawn expecting resistance. They were surprised to find women in military uniforms. They seemed uncertain whether we were combatants or civilians. After consultation with officers, they ordered us to Santo Tomas University, which was being converted into internment camp. We marched through Manila streets carrying what possessions we could. Civilians watched silently, some crying, some looking away. We didn't know if we'd ever see freedom again. The memoir documented arrival at Santo Tomas. According to published account, university had been commandeered to hold Allied civilians and military prisoners. Approximately 3,000 people would eventually be confined here, American and British civilians who had been living in Philippines, plus our 77 military nurses. Japanese established strict rules, obey all orders, no communication with outside, no medical treatment without permission, limited food allocations based on Japanese military rations. Conditions were harsh but initially not brutal. Guards seemed unsure how to treat us. Most significantly, the memoir described nurses' immediate response to conditions. According to published account, we assessed situation quickly. Medical conditions in camp were terrible: overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, no disease control measures. Without medical intervention, epidemics would kill hundreds. We requested permission to establish hospital. Japanese initially refused. We persisted, arguing that disease outbreaks would threaten guards as well as prisoners. After 2 weeks, Japanese grudgingly authorized small medical facility with severe restrictions on supplies and operations. This authorization gave us opening we needed. We would use hospital as base for saving prisoners' lives. April 1942-1945. Bernatitus's memoir described 3 years of systematic defiance of Japanese regulations, with detail revealing patterns of calculated rule-breaking that kept hospital functioning. According to the memoir, Japanese regulations prohibited various medical procedures. The memoir stated, Japanese forbade surgery except for immediate life-threatening emergencies. They prohibited treating minor ailments, claiming prisoners should tolerate discomfort. They limited medication allocations to fractions of what patients needed. They restricted hospital capacity to 50 beds, claiming more wasn't necessary. Each regulation was designed either to save resources or to demonstrate Japanese control through making prisoners suffer. We systematically violated every regulation that would have meant patients dying unnecessarily. The memoir documented specific examples of defiance according to published account. The memoir stated, "When Japanese prohibited surgery, we performed operations at night when guards weren't watching. We posted lookouts to warn if guards approached. We developed silent surgical protocols using hand signals instead of verbal communication. We operated by flashlight when electricity was cut. When Japanese cut medication allocations, we improvised treatments using local plants and materials. We traded personal possessions for black market medicine from Filipino suppliers who risked execution to help us. We diluted medications to make supplies last longer while maintaining therapeutic effectiveness. Most significantly, the memoir revealed collective decision-making process about which risks to accept, according to published account. We held regular meetings discussing which orders to defy and which to follow. Some nurses advocated careful compliance to avoid provoking guards. Others argued that saving patients required accepting execution risk. We reached consensus through democratic voting. Majority decisions became collective commitment. No nurse would be abandoned if caught violating regulations. This unity meant Japanese couldn't divide us by punishing individuals. We stood together, accepting shared consequences of our defiance. 1942-1945. Captain Davison's diary documented extraordinary improvisation required to maintain medical care with virtually no supplies. The diary entries from 1942-1945 described resourcefulness according to preserved records. Entry from August 1942 stated, "Surgical instruments wearing out, no replacements available. We've learned to sharpen scalpels, repeatedly extending their life. We've created surgical tools from salvaged materials, spoons ground into retractors, bamboo fashioned into clamps, wire bent into tissue holders. Our makeshift instruments work adequately, though they'd horrify instructors from nursing school, but they save lives, and that's what matters." The diary documented medication improvisation according to preserved entries. Entry from December 1942 stated, "Antibiotics exhausted. Treating infections with improvised remedies based on pre-antibiotic medical knowledge, using honey as antibacterial agent, creating poultices from local plants with antimicrobial properties, boiling everything repeatedly for sterilization. Success rate is lower than with modern medicine, but better than nothing. Some patients die who would have survived with penicillin, but some survive who would have died without our improvised treatments." Most significantly, the diary described nutritional strategies preventing starvation. Entry from March 1943 stated, "Food allocations inadequate to prevent malnutrition. Prisoners losing weight rapidly. We've established system for supplementing rations, cultivating gardens in every available space, trading for food with guards and local suppliers. Prioritizing nutrition for sickest patients even if it means others get less. We rotate which patients receive supplemental nutrition, ensuring everyone gets extra calories periodically. System isn't fair, but it prevents deaths from starvation while working within constraints of limited total food supply." 1943. Meanwhile, across Philippines, American male POWs were experiencing vastly harsher treatment under Japanese captivity than female nurses at Santo Tomas were facing. Comparative analysis documented in various historical studies showed stark gender-based treatment differences. Male POWs who were military personnel experienced forced labor lasting 12 to 16 hours daily in mines, fields, and construction sites. They faced systematic beatings as routine punishment for minor infractions. Starvation rations provided only 600 to 900 calories daily, when human bodies require approximately 2,000 calories minimum for basic survival. Medical neglect meant minimal treatment for disease and injuries, with most camps lacking even basic medical supplies. Mortality rate reached approximately 27%, as roughly 6,450 of the 25,000 American male POWs captured in Philippines died in captivity from disease, starvation, execution, and forced labor under brutal conditions. Execution threats and constant intimidation characterized their daily experience. Female POWs who were military nurses performed light duties primarily consisting of medical work within camps. Physical abuse was occasional but not systematic, like the daily beatings male prisoners endured. Reduced rations provided 1,200 to 1,500 calories daily, which was still inadequate for maintaining health, but represented significantly better nutrition than male prisoners received. Medical care was permitted, allowing nurses to treat themselves and other internees, which provided survival advantage through disease prevention and treatment. Mortality rate was approximately 5%, which was dramatically lower than male prisoner death rates, though still representing tragic loss of life. Control tactics emphasized psychological intimidation rather than the physical violence that characterized male POW camps. This disparity, according to historical analysis, reflected Japanese military culture's gender-based assumptions about appropriate treatment of different prisoner categories. Male prisoners were viewed as defeated warriors deserving harsh treatment and forced labor as punishment for surrendering rather than fighting to death, as Japanese military code demanded. Female prisoners were viewed as non-combatants requiring control but not deserving same level of brutality reserved for male soldiers. This cultural attitude, deeply problematic in its sexism and its assumption that women weren't legitimate military targets, ironically created survival advantage for female POWs relative to male prisoners who faced systematically harsher treatment. 1944. Bernatitus's memoir described 1944 as crisis year when conditions deteriorated dramatically as Japanese resources collapsed and guards became increasingly unpredictable. According to the memoir, food allocations were cut repeatedly throughout 1944. The memoir stated, by mid-1944, daily rations had been reduced to starvation levels. Adults received approximately 700 calories daily, less than half minimum for survival. Prisoners were dying from malnutrition-related diseases. Beriberi became epidemic due to vitamin B deficiency. Edema from protein deficiency became universal. Everyone lost dramatic amounts of weight. Many prisoners dropped below 100 pounds. Medical knowledge told us death rate would accelerate unless nutrition improved. But Japanese couldn't or wouldn't increase allocations. The memoir documented nurses' response to starvation crisis. According to published account, we intensified efforts to supplement rations through any means possible. We expanded gardens dramatically. We sent delegations to guards begging for increased allocations. We traded everything we still possessed for food. We organized food distribution, ensuring sickest patients received priority. We maintained detailed records tracking each patient's weight and nutritional status, allowing us to intervene before starvation became irreversible. These efforts slowed death rate, but couldn't prevent malnutrition affecting everyone, including ourselves. Most significantly, the memoir revealed that nurses faced own health crisis. According to published account, by late 1944, we nurses were also suffering severe malnutrition. Several nurses developed beriberi, others showed signs of protein deficiency. We couldn't exempt ourselves from starvation affecting entire camp, but we couldn't stop working because patients needed us. We made pact that we'd continue working until we literally collapsed. Several nurses kept working despite being barely able to stand. We supported each other physically, literally holding each other up during rounds when weakness made walking difficult. Our commitment to patients overrode concern for our own health. February 1945. Captain Davison's diary entries from February 1945 documented final weeks before liberation when prisoners heard artillery fire indicating American forces were approaching Manila. The diary entry from February 15, 1945 stated, according to preserved records, "Artillery fire audible from north. Americans are approaching Manila. Guards are nervous. Meetings occurring more frequently. Orders becoming contradictory. Commandant summoned senior prisoners warning that if Americans attack camp, guards have orders to execute all prisoners. This threat is credible. Japanese have demonstrated willingness to commit atrocities. We face possibility that liberation might arrive too late if guards carry out execution orders." The diary documented nurses' decision to continue working despite execution threat. Entry from February 20th stated, "Discussed whether to continue operating hospital or hide in hopes of surviving if guards start executing prisoners. Vote was again unanimous. We keep hospital running. Our patients need us. If we hide, sick prisoners die even if liberation arrives tomorrow. If guards execute us, at least we die serving patients as nurses should. This decision may be suicide, but it's consistent with commitment we made 3 years ago to never abandon patients regardless of personal risk." Most significantly, diary entry from February 23rd captured moment when liberation arrived. According to preserved entry, 0400 hours, heavy artillery fire from north, sounds close, perhaps within miles. 0800, guards agitated, more meetings. 1600, explosions getting louder, Americans definitely approaching. 2100, tanks crash through gates, American soldiers pouring into camp, 1st Cavalry Division, we're free. Guards surrendered without executing prisoners. Liberation arrived just hours before situation might have turned catastrophic. All 77 nurses survived. All our patients survived. 3 years of imprisonment ended. We embraced each other, weeping with joy and relief and disbelief that we actually survived. March 1945. Military medical assessment conducted immediately after liberation, documented in Army Medical Department reports preserved at National Archives, evaluated nurses' medical work during captivity. The assessment stated that Santo Tomas Hospital treated approximately 10,000 patient admissions over 3 years. According to the report, medical records maintained by nurses document 10,237 distinct patient admissions between January 1942 and February 1945. Conditions treated included surgical emergencies numbering 847 cases, infectious diseases totaling 3,421 cases, malnutrition-related conditions reaching 4,166 cases, chronic disease management comprising 1,238 cases, obstetric care involving 347 cases, and psychiatric conditions requiring 218 cases. Treatment outcomes exceeded expectations given severe resource constraints under which medical staff operated. The assessment analysed survival rates according to archives. The report stated, overall mortality rate for patients treated at Santo Tomas Hospital was 8.3%, representing 847 deaths among 10,237 total admissions over a 3-year period. This rate compares favourably with field hospitals operating under combat conditions with full supplies and equipment. Given that Santo Tomas Hospital operated with virtually no medication, improvised equipment fashioned from salvaged materials, and starving medical staff working extended hours, achieving 91.7% survival rate represents remarkable medical achievement, demonstrating extraordinary dedication and skill. Most significantly, the assessment attributed success to specific factors. According to the report, key factors enabling success included nurses' professional training and discipline, maintaining high standards despite impossible conditions, systematic approach to resource allocation, maximizing benefit from limited supplies, willingness to work extended hours despite own malnutrition and exhaustion, improvisation using local materials when standard medical equipment was unavailable, calculated defiance of Japanese restrictions that would have prevented necessary treatment, and mutual support maintaining morale during prolonged hardship. These factors combine to enable medical outcomes that quantitative resource analysis suggests should have been impossible to achieve. April 1945. Meanwhile, as nurses recovered from captivity, American military authorities were documenting Japanese treatment of Allied POWs for war crimes investigations. Allied POW treatment documentation, compiled in 1945, preserved at National Archives, compared treatment across different prisoner categories, revealing gender-based disparities that influenced war crimes prosecutions. The documentation stated that approximately 25,000 American servicemen were captured in Philippines during 1941-1942 Japanese offensive. According to records, male military POWs experienced systematic brutality, including forced labor in mines and construction projects, routine beatings and torture as punishment for minor infractions, starvation rations providing inadequate calories for survival, medical neglect resulting in preventable deaths from treatable conditions, and high mortality rates reflecting harsh treatment. Approximately 6,750 American male POWs died in Japanese captivity, representing 27% mortality rate. Deaths resulted from disease exacerbated by malnutrition, starvation from inadequate rations, execution for alleged infractions, and forced labor under brutal conditions that killed weakened prisoners. The documentation noted that 77 American military nurses captured in Philippines all survived, representing zero mortality among this specific prisoner group. According to records, zero mortality among military nurses represents remarkable survival rate compared to 27% mortality among male military POWs. Survival was partly attributable to Japanese cultural attitudes, treating female prisoners less brutally than male prisoners based on gender assumptions. But survival also resulted from nurses' medical knowledge, preventing disease through sanitation and treatment protocols, organizational discipline maintaining group morale and mutual support, and calculated defiance of regulations, ensuring adequate medical care for themselves and other internees despite Japanese restrictions. Most significantly, the documentation addressed war crimes implications of differential treatment. According to records, Japanese treatment of male POWs clearly violated Geneva Convention through systematic abuse, inadequate nutrition, medical neglect, and forced labor under conditions causing high mortality rates. Treatment of female POWs, while harsh and involving inadequate nutrition and poor conditions, generally avoided systematic physical abuse characterizing male POW treatment. This gender-based disparity in treatment standards reflects Japanese military culture's assumptions about appropriate treatment of defeated male warriors versus female non-combatants. Both treatment patterns violated international law, but male POW treatment constituted more systematic violations, warranting war crimes prosecution. 1946 data in 1950s. Post-war experience of Santo Tomas nurses documented in various sources showed psychological impacts of captivity and challenges reintegrating into normal life. Army Nurse Corps' assessment from 1946 documented that all 77 nurses returned to United States and received comprehensive medical evaluation. According to the assessment, physical examination revealed that all nurses showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, including average weight loss of 35 pounds compared to pre-capture weights representing significant physical deterioration. Several nurses exhibited permanent health effects, including weakened immune systems, making them susceptible to infections, dental problems from vitamin deficiency during critical growth years, and joint issues from malnutrition during development. However, all nurses recovered sufficiently to return to nursing duties within 6 months of repatriation, demonstrating remarkable physical resilience. The assessment noted psychological impacts according to archives. The assessment stated, psychological evaluations revealed that most nurses exhibited symptoms of what would later be termed post-traumatic stress, including nightmares about captivity, hypervigilance about food security manifesting in food hoarding behaviors, anxiety about confinement making enclosed spaces difficult to tolerate, and difficulty trusting authority figures based on trauma from Japanese guards. However, nurses' strong group cohesion and sense of purpose from having saved patients appeared to provide protective psychological factors, reducing severity of symptoms. Depression and dysfunction rates were lower than among other POW populations who lacked similar group support and purposeful activity during captivity. Multiple nurses returned to military nursing careers according to military records, showing remarkable commitment to profession despite traumatic captivity. Captain Davison continued serving until retirement in 1951, completing full military career. Lieutenant Bernatitus served through Korean War, retiring in 1954 with distinguished service record. Approximately 40 of the 77 nurses remained in military nursing careers for at least 10 years post-war, according to personnel records tracking career patterns. This high retention rate suggested that military nursing remained a meaningful career despite traumatic captivity experience, and that professional identity developed during captivity sustained commitment to service. 1985. Ann Bernatitus's 1985 memoir, Defiant Nurses, provided retrospective analysis of captivity experience, with detail revealing how nurses understood their defiance 40 years later. The memoir's assessment stated, "Looking back 40 years later, I believe our survival resulted from 4 factors working together. Professional training gave us purpose and skills, enabling us to serve patients, which provided meaning, sustaining us psychologically. Group cohesion prevented isolation and depression that destroyed other prisoners through mutual support and shared commitment. Calculated defiance ensured we maintained control over medical decisions rather than letting Japanese regulations determine patient outcomes, which gave us agency in situations designed to make us powerless. And gender-based Japanese assumptions meant we faced harsh treatment, but not systematic violence male POWs endured, which provided survival advantage we didn't fully understand at the time. We were lucky, skilled, determined, and benefited from Japanese cultural blind spots regarding appropriate treatment of women." The memoir addressed criticism that nurses should have been more confrontational. According to published account, some critics argue we should have resisted more aggressively or attempted escape rather than accepting imprisonment. I disagree fundamentally with this criticism. Our mission was keeping patients alive, not making symbolic gestures of resistance. Aggressive resistance would have provoked Japanese to close hospital or execute us, ending our ability to provide medical care. Escape attempts would have likely failed given our location on island controlled by Japanese forces, and would have resulted in executions affecting others beyond just escapees. We achieved our mission. All 77 nurses survived, and we treated 10,000 patients with 91.7% survival rate. This success came from calculated defiance, choosing which battles we could win rather than making symbolic gestures that would have gotten people killed without achieving anything meaningful. Most significantly, the memoir reflected on meaning of their experience. According to published account, what did we prove through our experience? That women could endure combat stress and captivity as well as men when given opportunity to demonstrate capability. That professional training and discipline enable survival in extreme conditions by providing purpose and structure. That calculated courage achieves better outcomes than reckless bravery when survival depends on making sophisticated judgments about which risks to accept. That serving others provides meaning, enabling psychological resilience when suffering would be unbearable without purpose. That unity and mutual support matter more than individual heroism when survival depends on group cohesion. And that sometimes defying orders is more courageous than following them when orders contradict fundamental duty. We were ordinary women who faced extraordinary circumstances. We did what nurses do. We took care of patients. That we did it under Japanese imprisonment for 3 years doesn't make us exceptional. It makes us nurses who refuse to abandon our duty regardless of cost. The Santo Tomas nurses' experience revealed fundamental truths about survival in captivity, professional duty, calculated defiance, and gender dynamics in wartime treatment of prisoners. First truth: professional training and organizational discipline enable survival in extreme conditions by providing structure, purpose, and skills applicable to crisis situations. The nurses' medical knowledge prevented disease outbreaks that would have killed hundreds in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Their nursing training gave them purpose that sustained morale when suffering without meaning would have caused psychological breakdown. Their military discipline enabled them to organize collectively and support each other through hardship when isolation would have destroyed individuals. These professional factors proved as important as material resources for surviving 3 years of captivity. Second truth: calculated defiance achieves better outcomes than either total compliance or reckless resistance when survival requires sophisticated judgment about acceptable risks. Total compliance with Japanese regulations would have meant patient deaths from preventable causes that nurses could have treated. Reckless resistance would have provoked guards to close hospital or execute nurses, ending their ability to provide medical care. Calculated defiance, systematically violating regulations necessary for patient care while avoiding provocative confrontation that would trigger retaliation, enabled nurses to maintain medical operations without provoking guards to shut down hospital. This middle path required sophisticated judgment about which rules to break and how to minimize risk while maximizing benefit to patients. Third truth: group cohesion and mutual support enable psychological resilience, preventing breakdown during prolonged captivity when isolation would destroy individuals. The nurses' commitment to each other, their pact that no one would be abandoned, their democratic decision-making about risk acceptance creating shared responsibility, their physical and emotional support during crisis when individuals couldn't survive alone, prevented isolation and depression that destroyed other prisoners lacking similar group bonds. Strong group identity protected individuals from psychological collapse by providing meaning through relationships and shared purpose, transcending individual suffering. Fourth truth: gender-based assumptions create different treatment patterns for male versus female prisoners, with significant survival implications that reveal cultural attitudes about appropriate treatment. Japanese military culture's view of male prisoners as legitimate targets for abuse versus female prisoners as less threatening non-combatants created survival advantage for women, despite harsh conditions affecting both groups. This disparity, problematic in its sexism, assuming women weren't real soldiers deserving equal treatment, ironically enabled female nurses to survive at much higher rates than male POWs facing systematic brutality. Understanding these gender dynamics is essential for analyzing POW treatment patterns and their survival outcomes. Fifth truth: serving others provides psychological meaning that enables endurance of suffering that would be unbearable without purpose, giving meaning to survival. The nurses could have focused solely on their own survival, maximizing personal safety through compliance. Instead, they dedicated themselves to patient care despite personal cost, accepting risks to save others. This service orientation provided meaning that sustained them through starvation, disease, and constant threat when suffering without purpose would have been psychologically unbearable. Purpose derived from serving others proved more powerful psychological protection than focusing on personal survival, which can lead to despair when conditions seem hopeless. The 77 American military nurses who defied Japanese orders and kept their hospital alive for 3 years demonstrated that courage isn't absence of fear, but commitment to duty despite fear paralyzing others. Their defiance wasn't reckless bravery, but calculated risk-taking aimed at saving patients through sophisticated judgment about acceptable risks. Their survival wasn't luck, but combination of skill, determination, mutual support, and careful judgment about which battles to fight when resources were desperately limited. Ann Bernatitus's memoir captured this complexity in its conclusion. We weren't heroes performing dramatic acts of courage. We were nurses who refused to let regulations designed to let patients die prevent us from doing our jobs, serving those who depended on us. We violated orders when following them would have meant patient deaths. We risked execution when accepting risk was necessary for providing care. We endured starvation, maintaining strength to continue working. We improvised treatments from materials that would have horrified our instructors but saved lives anyway. We worked ourselves to collapse repeatedly but kept going because patients needed us. But we kept our hospital alive, treating 10,000 patients, and all 77 of us survived to tell the story. That's not heroism deserving special recognition. That's just nursing under impossible conditions. We did what nurses do. We took care of patients regardless of obstacles. The Japanese orders didn't matter compared to our duty. Our professional obligation mattered more than regulations, and we fulfilled that obligation despite everything trying to prevent us. 40 years after liberation, when survivors gathered to commemorate their experience, they reflected on what their defiance had meant for understanding women's capabilities in combat situations. They had proven that women could endure combat captivity as well as men when given opportunity. They had demonstrated that professional duty could override personal survival instinct when values demanded sacrifice. They had shown that calculated courage achieved better outcomes than dramatic gestures when success required sophisticated judgment. And they had testified that sometimes serving others matters more than following orders, especially when following orders means abandoning those who depend on you for survival. The mathematics of their survival were written in 10,000 patient charts documenting every admission and treatment outcome, improvised treatments fashioned from inadequate materials, proving resourcefulness overcomes scarcity, and night surgeries performed while guards weren't watching, demonstrating courage through defiance. Those mathematics proved that determination combined with professional skill could overcome resource poverty that should have been insurmountable according to standard medical calculations. The 77 nurses who defied Japan's orders and kept their hospital alive for 3 years demonstrated that sometimes the most courageous act isn't dramatic defiance, but sustained commitment to duty performed quietly despite constant danger over years of captivity testing resolved repeatedly.